that all the participants, if all the participants in the chat could rename themselves to note the community that you're representing here today, that will help our speakers know who's in the room. And since we won't have time to do introductions with everybody, so to change your name, just hover over your name, click those 3 dots and change it to include the affiliation of the community you work for. So on the next slide, we'll talk about the learning questions and learning objectives for today's session. So our learning questions today are, how do municipal governments in Massachusetts function? Which is a big question that we're hoping to dive into and get some clarity on today from our 2 great speakers. And we hope that you'll also be able to know, what do I need to know now? What do I need to know now about municipal financing and capital planning to be successful in my role? So by the end of this session, we think you'll be able to understand how government is structured in your municipality and what government structure it operates under. You'll be able to describe the role of key elected officials and staff in your municipality. You'll be able to describe how local budgets and financing operate at a high level and have an understanding of how local clean energy projects can be part of a capital planning process in your municipality. So on the next slide, we have our introductory polls. We have a few questions just to get a sense of where everybody in the room is at before we jump into our speakers. So Julia will pull those up for everybody. We'll give folks a few moments to fill those out. And there's a few questions. Once you finish them, you'll be on to the next one. All right, getting some answers coming in. We'll give folks 1 more minute to finish filling out the questions because I know there's a lot of those.
Also, just want to acknowledge a typo in the polls. There are 2 strongly agrees. The one that's closest to the disagree should be strongly disagree. So sorry about that. But I think folks are picking up on that.
Okay. It looks like I think we're set. Julia was having most folks having participated. We're going to pull up the results. We see here, so I understand the government structure my municipality is operating under. It looks like we have a mix of most folks are either neutral or agree, and a few strongly agrees and a few disagrees. I can describe the role of key elected officials and staff in my municipality. Most folks are in the neutral and some in disagree and agree, a few who strongly agree. Looks like there will be great content to jump into on how local budgets and financing operate at a high level, since most folks there are at neutral or disagree. Or I understand how local clean energy projects can be part of a capital planning process in my municipality. A whole mix of range here from agree to neutral to disagree. It looks like a pretty even spread. And then for how clean energy projects can be part of the capital planning process, a mix of neutral and disagree there. We have a really healthy mix between folks who work in a city, towns, multiple towns, and RPAs in the group. And it looks like most communities have a capital plan, but there are a few folks who aren't sure. And then most communities do have a sustainability committee, so a few do not. And it looks like most folks have had a chance to meet their city or town administrator, which is fantastic. Stop sharing those. And then we'll jump in just to an overview of the agenda. So we just did our opening, and then we're going to do 2 kind of lecture sessions followed by Q&A. So the first section will talk about the structure of cities and towns and municipalities and also school committees. So Sean will speak about towns and George will speak about cities and school committees. We'll pause and have 15 minutes for Q&A for the group. And then we'll jump into the second session, which will be about municipal financing at a high level and capital planning, and then some on the ground examples of projects and how this plays out from George and Watertown, including highlighting their new high school. And then we'll have 15 minutes for Q&A after that as well. So jumping forward to the next slide, just to give them brief introductions. We're joined today and we're so excited because these are both busy folks with great experience. So Sean Cronin has been the Senior Deputy Commissioner for Local Services at the Department of Revenue since February 2015, and he serves as the Secretary of Administration and Finances designee. Prior to that, Sean spent 17 years working in Brookline, and for the last 12, he was the Deputy Town Administrator. And he has a master's degree in public administration from the Maxwell School at Syracuse University. And then George Proakis has been the City Manager of Watertown since August 2022. And before becoming City Manager, he was the Executive Director of the Office of Strategic Planning and Community Development in Somerville, Massachusetts. George is the founding member of the New England chapter of the Congress of New Urbanism, and he also teaches at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University. He holds a Master's of City Planning at MIT and a Master's of Public Administration from the Maxwell School at Syracuse as well. I'm not sure if Sean and George were there at the same time, but they definitely have worked together before and know each other well. It looks like
we missed each other by 2 years, I believe.
Okay, the fellow alums. So we'll jump into it.
Yes.
So Sean will go first, and then George. We'll have about 25 minutes to half an hour for them to talk and then jump into Q&A. If you have questions as we go, please feel free to put them in the chat. Julie is going to track those to make sure we get through them all. And then we'll have a chance for folks to ask questions live as well. All right, thanks, Sean.
All right. So 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts, 292 of them are technically towns, and I'll get into that a little bit, and 59 are cities, and there's little variances between each of those. Next slide. So here's a nice graphic that shows the difference of where all the towns are versus the cities, and the town, technically cities, but call themselves a town. Next slide. All right, so I'm going to talk about town governance. Again, I spent almost 2 decades in town form of government. But generally speaking, municipalities are known as creatures of the state because their existence and all their powers come from the state legislature. There's this thing called Dillon's Rule, which is a legal principle that states that local governments only have powers that are expressly granted by state law, implied from those granted powers, or essential to the municipality's existence. There's a home rule amendment, and this came in, I want to say, in the 60s. That granted municipalities a degree of separation from the strict limitations of that Dillon's Rule by allowing them to exercise any power or function that the state legislature has the authority to delegate, as long as the local action is not inconsistent with the state law or constitution. So one example is taxes. Municipalities cannot develop their own taxation structure. Whether it be property or sales or income or anything like that. They would have to get approval from the state. I already mentioned there's 292 towns, and that's defining it as a town meeting form of government. Town meeting is a legislative body. We're not including the cities with a mayor and a city manager, of which there are 45, nor the 14 towns that have a town council form of government. So instead of having a town meeting, you have a manager and a council form of government. There's about 14 of those. And all towns are governed in some way, shape, or form by a charter, bylaws, or special acts, which are also known as home rule petitions that got to be approved by the state legislature. So I'm sure you can imply from that that there is this parental-child relationship between the state and municipalities, where the state has to say yes or no to some things that communities want to do. So, you know, as a local official, it can be a little bit frustrating at times. Next slide. All right, so in the town, the legislative body is this thing called town meeting. John Q. Public thinks town meeting is when there's a meeting in town hall. Well, town meeting is when the legislative body gets together. There are 2 types of town meetings. There's a representative and there's open. So there's about 260 open, which means as long as you're a registered voter, you can show up at town meeting and vote. Then there's representative, which is what I worked in the Brookline. There's about 32 of these where you have precincts and, you know, X number of town meeting members come from each precinct. And the ranges go from a low of 50 to all the way up to more than 400. Brookline, I think, was like 260, if I remember correctly. So very different dynamics between open and representative. We can talk about it in the Q&A if you want, but it's very, you know, very different. no matter what kind of town meeting you have, there's a standing committee that goes by various names, but it's the same entity. It can be called the advisory committee or finance committee, also known as FinCom, a warrant committee, and there's some other names too. But they're basically the standing body of town meeting that serves as a body that's going to give them analysis of warrant articles or make some budget recommendations to them. So they're a very powerful body in a town meeting form of government. So I mentioned warrant. A warrant is basically the agenda for town meeting. So it's a list of everything that's going to be voted on. It's approved by the select board, and then it's got to be issued so that residents know that there's a town meeting coming. And then the articles on the warrant can consist of all of these types of things: budget matters, your annual budget, bond authorizations for capital projects, general bylaw changes, zoning bylaw changes, acceptance of local options like a local option meals tax or a stretch code, which you are all more familiar with than I am. Town meeting can approve home rule petitions to send to the state for approval, resolutions, land sale, acquisition, etc., and actually the salaries of elected officials. So you go to town meeting, you can be voting on all of these things. And in most towns, there's an annual in the spring, and then sometimes a special in the fall to finalize your budget, or in Brookline, it was a very heavy zoning related town meeting. So land use was always mostly in the fall. Next slide. All right, so who's the executive? Well, the executive are multiple people. It's a select board, and that can be 3 or 5 members. I don't think there's anything more than a 3 or 5 member board in Massachusetts. So they are your chief elected executive, and then the policy making body. In most cases, they hire a town manager, town administrator, which I'll talk about in a minute. In some cases, they hire department heads. So they hire your police chief, fire chief, DPW commissioner, building commissioner, etc. They develop, initiate, and or implement policies, and there's a huge range of what those can cover: financial policies, HR policies, licensing, social media, etc. So they are the policy making body. They also have to call elections, including Prop 2.5 ballot questions, which we'll talk about in a while when we talk about finances. They appoint boards and commissions and committees. Then they are definitely involved in various aspects of finance. At a minimum, they review a budget. They set the annual property tax rate. They accept grants. They approve the issuance of debt, and they execute contracts, including collective bargaining agreements, CBAs, which I'll talk about in a little bit. In a lot of places, they're also the licensing board. They were in Brookline, so there were a lot of time spent with alcohol licenses, CVs, lodging houses, special permits, etc. That's your select board, and they also prepare the warrant for town meeting. Next slide. So as I mentioned, most communities hire a town manager, town administrator. There's also terms town coordinator, executive assistant. They are basically the chief administrative officer who responsible for day-to-day operations and keyword to implement policies set by the elected officials. So your select board's elected, they create the policies. Your town manager, town administrator is elected, and they help implement the policies. There's no definition in state law, so the role does vary all across the state. Even within the same title, they can have different responsibilities. And some of them can be very strong in terms of authority, and some can be weak in quotes. You probably have heard the term strong town manager. That means they have appointment authority of all department heads. They are responsible for putting the budget together and the capital plan together. And they might even assume some responsibilities like signing off on the approval of payments, what's called a payment warrant. But very different in every town across the state. And here's some responsibilities, some examples. They have to be outlined in either the town charter, a bylaw, or a special act. And again, they all vary across the state. And there are some things that they could be responsible for. Next slide. So every town has a list of departments. The bigger they are, the town, the larger the departments will be, the more departments you'll have. So this varies across the state, but normally you'll have public safety, you'll have public health, some sort of DPW, it could be a highway department, library. You have to have finance. Those are statutorily required positions. Hopefully there's some sort of IT and personnel. Not all towns have planning and community development. I think they rely a little bit more on their RPAs. Council on Aging, veterans, you have to have veterans. It can be regional, but you have to have it. They have some sort of legal, whether it's in-house or contractual. And then every town has a town clerk. And there's a mix between elected and appointed positions, but you have to have a town clerk. And then just hit enter for a second. So here's a list of boards and commissions. Again, it varies by town. I'm sure you all know this. You're probably in the middle of these. Town government is governed by committee, for better or for worse. So you have the FinCom, which I mentioned, which could be called advisory committee or warrant committee, and all these key boards, which play a huge role in town government. Planning board, ZBA, historic commission, Concom, Park and Rec commission, Board of Health, and I'm not going to read through all of these, but, and this isn't even an exhaustive list. I'm sure there's some communities that have more than these. So you've got to understand what your board and commission structure is. Do they have policy making authority, or are they making recommendations to the select board? Again, that will vary in every town, but you're going to have a bunch of boards and commissions in the town. Next slide. Okay, so school department. And while this generally holds true for city form of government too, I'm going to focus on town. So there's an elected school committee. And kind of like the select board, their primary role is big picture, governance, establish goals, policies, objectives, etc. And they hire a superintendent who is similar to the town manager in some respects in terms of they're responsible for the day-to-day operation of the school district. The school committee normally has 5 to 9 members. I know it varies everywhere, but that's kind of the norm. So again, your superintendent, day-to-day operations, implementing policies, huge role in financial management. They do hire a school business manager, which is effectively the CFO for the schools. Budget authority is really interesting, and this goes back decades. So unlike a municipal budget, so I'm sure you know what your local budget sort of looks like. You go to town meeting, at a minimum, all the departments are listed, and probably it lists, X dollars for personnel costs, Y dollars for non-personnel costs at a minimum. In Brookline, it was far more extensive than that, but point being, town meeting would go through department by department and take a vote on it. For the schools, it's one big number. And at the end of the day, whatever town meeting says, you have schools. The school then sets their final budget allocations in the financial system. And then they are responsible for transfers during the course of the year, between, say, English department or math department, whatever it might be. They are the ones, the school committee, who has the authority. It's not town meeting, it's not the select board. So a lot of budget autonomy for the school department. In similar vein, collective bargaining agreements with the schools, they're bargained by and approved by the school committee. On the town side, CBAs need to go to town meeting to be funded. So a little bit different there as well. And then there are regional school districts, which can be complicated. The larger they are, the more, meaning the more number of towns that are part of it, the more complicated it can get, because the way they're financed is an assessment back to the member towns based upon some formula that's been agreed upon when the regional school was created. Normally it's on head count or number of pupils. So if I'm a town and I'm a part of a regional school district, the assessment number from the regional school is coming to the town, and then town meeting needs to build that into their budget. So very different dynamic. I've never personally been involved in a community that's had regional school, but in hearing people talk about it, that can be more complicated than if you have a more traditional one town school. And then the last thing I'm going to say about this, and I was very fortunate to have a great little working relationship on the school side in my Brookline days. You have to have a good relationship with the town and the school, and it can be challenging because there's, right or wrong, better for us, there's always clashes between the municipal side and the school side due to financing, due to budget, and we'll talk about why that is the case. But 50 to 60% plus of a budget normally goes for education. So you have to have a good relationship. I spent more time with the school business manager in Brookline than I did with my boss. We had a great working relationship. We didn't agree on everything, but at least we could agree to disagree. So that's something that I think is really important to note. And then also related to capital, there's facilities, right? And those need to be maintained both inside and outside. And eventually those have to be either upgraded, modernized, or replaced. And that's huge money. If you think of a school project, so I live in Stoneham and we just did a new high school, like $275 million. And we're a small high school. I also sit on the MSBA, so I see all the costs that come through. Schools of $400, $500, $600 million. Those get financed through the issuance of debt, which is funded out of the municipal budget. So there has to be a good working relationship between the two. So I think that's it on my end, right? Yep, and then I'm turning it over to George to talk about cities.
Sure. Thank you, Sean. So I'm going to share a little perspective on the other 59 communities in Massachusetts. And the first thing I will say is the difference between a city and town, as Sean said, is essentially the operation of town meeting or a council system. It certainly it has not nearly as much to do with size. The town of Palmer is using a city form government with a community of 12,400. Brookline is using a town form government. Sean probably knows better than I what the population is there, but it's a lot more. It's a lot more than that. And so I want to share a little bit about the 59 communities that basically don't use town meeting and kind of how they work. 14, as I said, call themselves town, even though they operate with the city form. And 44 operate with a strong mayor type of government with basically the mayor as the chief executive. Go to the next slide. So the 14 communities, this is from Mass Municipal Association's list. Oftentimes with these 14, you'll see them use the term town council rather than city council. But they operate the same as cities in that the council is the legislative body and there isn't a town meeting to be the legislative body in those circumstances. You can go to the next slide. So this shares a little bit about who holds the chief executive officer position in the 59 city form governments. I will say this, the purple, which is both mayor and city manager, which is Lowell, Cambridge, and Worcester. Essentially in that case, the position that they call mayor is essentially a city council president. The city council president position operates as if it has the title mayor and often does the ribbon cuttings and the parades and all of those sort of things as the city mayor, but the day-to-day management of the city in those three communities is in the hands of the manager, similar to the communities that are colored in green. To go to the next one. So this is pretty much a repeat of the previous one. I just wanted to point out, Watertown used to be amongst the 14 and switched to just calling themselves a city in 2021. From 1981 to 2021, Watertown was officially the city known as the town of Watertown. And you'll see some of those governments that want to maintain the name town because they want that small town feel, but nonetheless want to not use town meeting as an operating system, that those 14 have relied on that sort of a title to be able to do so. But I'm grouping them in with the rest of the group as 59 together because they're the 59 that basically operate without town meeting. And as Sean mentioned, town meeting is the legislative body of town government. In these other 59 communities, the legislative body is the council. They'll call themselves town council or city council. But they serve as the legislative body. Go to the next slide. And then the chief executive is either a mayor or a city manager, town administrator type position. And what you'll see is that there are 44, so there are 15 communities out of the cities that use a manager type position, and those are the 15. And you see a lot of the smaller ones are actually the ones still calling them themselves town. And a lot of the ones calling themselves town go on the manager system. There's a handful, Worcester, Cambridge, Lowell, Chelsea, Watertown, that call themselves cities and have a city manager type position in Massachusetts. If you go to the next slide, if you sort of intersperse and connect the two, what you realize is that 4 of the communities that call themselves towns have mayors, which I guess is probably the rarest combination of a mayor form government and calling yourself a town. But nonetheless, those four do that. But they really are, again, city form governments because they have a mayor. They don't have a town meeting set up. So if you go on to the next one, either as I said, what they have in common is they have no town meeting. They have a council that serves as the legislative body. What they don't have in common is the size of the council and how they are elected. It's very different and ranges from a variety of different positions. Somerville, for example, 7 ward councilors, 4 elected at large, a total of 11. Watertown here, we have 4 elected in districts, we have 4 elected at large, and then we have a council president who is separately elected at large for a total of 9. Cambridge uses ranked choice voting and elects everybody at large, and then they select a mayor as their council president from amongst their council members to give the title mayor. Lowell did all at large when I used to work there, and then actually got a federal lawsuit on how the council didn't reflect the community's demographics and ended up going to a district and at large mix. There's some folks who want to do councils with all districts. I'm not a big fan of that idea because I think you need some representation across the city, but nonetheless, there's a lot of different ways to do this in terms of size of the council and how it works. The second thing that varies is who the chief executive is. And I will say here, what's interesting about the town form government is that the technical executive role in the town form government, that side of the government falls with the select board. Here it falls with either an elected mayor or an appointed manager who is managing the day-to-day operations. And I think most significantly what you'll see as a difference is typically that mayor or manager does have the ability to hire all the department heads, does have the ability to make appointments to all the city boards and commissions. Every now and then you will find an elected board, commission, or position, but you see less and less of it in city government. So like in Watertown, for example, the elected boards in the city are the council, the school committee, and the board of library trustees. And even then there's some conversation among some people who are like, well, why is the board of library trustees elected? You'll see some other communities where the planning board's elected or other boards are elected. Typically more and more in city government, you'll see council and school committee and not too much else. Go to the next one. I think it's always worth looking at a city or town charter and really to get an understanding of how government is set up. It really serves essentially as the constitution for our local government, establishes the roles for different participants, how elections work, how budgets are created, how laws are passed. There's kind of a series of government plans under state law, or you can just kind of go your own way with kind of the way these charters work. Watertown passed and updated their charter in 2021. That was when they also dropped the calling themselves a town thing. Although it's the evolution of charters, typically every 10 years or so, a city will look at their charter and determine if they should make changes. I worked in Somerville before Watertown. We put together a charter review committee in 2021. I got to sit on the charter review committee for a while. It took the city council 4 more years to consider what was in that charter review. They put it on the ballot and it passed this November. So a home rule charter requires legislative approval. It's important, because as Sean said, since a local government is creation of the state, a local government can't just define themselves any way they want. If you want to change the number of councilors, if you want to change between a mayor and a manager form of government, if you want to change those things, typically you're building a home rule charter and developing the system you do. You're asking for legislative approval. You're asking for the voters in the community to approve it, and then it goes into place. You can go to the next one. Just to use Watertown as an example, most of the city governments that exist in Massachusetts were at some point a town with town meeting. It was the 1980-81 timeframe when Watertown made the step from removing town meeting and moving to a city form. They wanted more efficiency in the day-to-day way that they ran government, and town meeting ideally provides you real access to more direct democracy in the way that it works, whether they be open town meeting or even an elected town meeting with a large group of people. But generally speaking, when you go to the council manager or council mayor form of government, you have a legislative body that's not meeting twice a year, but is meeting once every week or once every 2 weeks or so. And that passing legislation and making changes in the community is a little bit easier to do in that way. The quote I had here from the 1980 Charter Commission was that they decided it was time to cast away their present government, and there was disagreement of whether or not change is needed. The area of disagreement was not whether or not change was needed, but whether what that change should be. And somewhere around my desk here, I have the little brochure they did in 1980, and there are like reports from different people with different opinions. One city councilor was determined that we should have a mayor form of government and not a manager form. There was one. Actually, I should say at the time they were town select board members. One of them didn't want to change, but over time they've debated it. The community voted. They voted to shift to a city form of government. You can flip to the next slide. And then the big decision, I think, every time a city talks about charter or talks about their organization is whether they should have a mayor or a city manager as their chief executive. I sat on the Somerville Charter Commission in 2021, where Somerville overwhelmingly decided to keep their strong mayor government. I watched the Watertown Commission, which formed just before I took the job here, where they overwhelmingly determined to keep their city manager form of government. Sometimes I think there's always a few people in each community who are sitting there asking themselves, well, why don't we have the other form? I was in line at an event this week where somebody just came right up and asked me that question. I have no offense to you. I have a question. Why doesn't Watertown have a mayor? And I'm like, well, that's, a decision the community makes when they look at their charter. And if they want, I guess the best way I would describe it is the advantage of a mayor form of government is that the voters have chosen the chief executive and that they are responsive directly to the voters under that circumstance. The advantage of the city manager form of government is that if you're going to put someone in charge of a $220 million annual budget and 400 people in an organization, which is what we have here in Watertown, and obviously varies by city or town, is a person who ran for office who may have zero experience ever managing government the right person to do that? Or would you rather hire someone who may be an outsider and may not be a day-to-day expert in the community, but what they are is able to understand how to run the budgets, run the organization, put the HR department together, hire department heads, and make the city government work the best it can? I don't think there's a right answer to this question. I would note that most places that have done city form governments in Massachusetts have done mayors, but there are very large cities around the United States that are run with city manager forms of government. If you go as I do to the annual city manager conferences, they'll spend a lot of time talking about the benefits of that particular system. You go on to the next slide. What is the role of a city council? I'm going to use Watertown as an example for these, but certainly, it differs by place. Our council meets every 2 weeks, except for some months. They pass the annual budget, they pass ordinances, they establish city policy and give direction to the manager. So it's a very clear division in a council manager form of government that they are the policy-making body of the city, and I am the administrative manager who takes advice from their policies. In a mayor form of government, typically the mayor is establishing the city policy. And in a manager form of government, the council hires the manager and sometimes a couple of other people. In Watertown's case, the auditor, the clerk, and the analyst, but everyone else is the manager's hire. You will find some town governments where appointed boards will be hiring people, where like the planning board will select the town planner. You don't tend to find that in city government. In city government, it's the city manager or the mayor who's making all those hiring decisions and putting the team together. Go to the next slide. Council president. Most councils will elect a president from amongst the people chosen. Watertown separately elects theirs. They're the presiding officer for the council. They're responsible for council goals. In the case where you don't have a mayor, they're responsible for the long-term vision of the city, in collaboration with the manager. They can vote as a councilor, but they have no like special power under those circumstances. Go on to the next one. The role of a city manager, and this is similar to a mayor in pretty much most city governments: appoint and supervise staff, prepare the budget, negotiate those collective bargaining agreements we were talking about, execute contracts, although some things require council approval, have jurisdiction over city facilities. In my case, not completely over the schools and the library because there are separate boards working on that. Make policy recommendation, execute deeds on properties, again, usually needing a council vote. I can't just go out and buy a piece of property for Watertown. Coordinate city communications and publish an annual report. Can go on. So what does the city CEO do all day? A lot of meetings and a lot of emails and a lot of phone calls. But in between all of that, the annual budget, selecting staff, setting goals, checking in with staff to make sure things are going well, spending time with constituents, and preparing for that council meeting to make sure that the legislative body has what they need. That's a lot of it. Go on. And you can go through any department list or list of multi-member boards. I think it's pretty similar to what Sean put up for town governments for the most part. But typically you'll find the managers appointing the board members and the council's approving them, or the mayor's appointing the council's approving them. You can go on. So just a word about schools. School committee is also established by charter, typically elected. I don't know a circumstance where it's not. Actually, Boston is the one where I think that's not. School committees hire a superintendent. In city governments, typically other staff is hired by the mayor or manager, like I said. Many city government school committees provide a seat for the mayor or the council president, or sometimes both. Somerville, I know, has both the mayor and the council president sitting on the school committee. In Watertown here, the council president sits as a school committee member as well. It helps build a link between the school committee and the council that's valuable. As Sean mentioned, and this is very important, that school budgets and capital planning really need to be developed along with the city side in order for everything to work. Even though we're giving a single number over to the schools, that number needs to work and keep the balance between the two sides. And it's very important for a superintendent and a manager or a mayor to work well together, and for a council and a school committee to work well together. Having that link with the council president helps a lot. Go on. All right, that's what I've got for now.
Move on to part 2. So fundamental concepts of municipal finance in Massachusetts and capital planning. So we have a mix of Sean and George giving a high-level overview of how municipal finance works, which will hopefully help everybody understand how to move clean energy projects forward. Over to you, Sean.
All right, we go to the next slide. So the key word there was broad overview. I could talk to you all about this for hours. Like, this is my love. I love this stuff. I'm doing it my whole professional career. But I won't get way into the weeds with you. But as the very last slide of my piece is a link to our website at DLS, where we have so much information available to you on all this stuff, from the basics to the more complicated. It's all there. My email address is there. Reach out to me if you ever have any questions. So local government finance in Massachusetts is dominated by property taxes. I'm in this thing called Prop 2.5, which I'll get to. But what I wanted to start off with is, where does the money come from? And then we'll end with why is there so much stress on a budget? And they're always talking about overrides and cuts and that type of stuff. So if you look at statewide numbers, this is from fiscal 25, about 2/3, it's round up, of all revenue is property taxes. Okay. The next biggest slice of the pie is state aid. And there's this revenue sharing program, which I'll talk about a little bit, between the state and the cities and towns, because the state collects all taxes except property. So they need to share some of that money back with cities and towns. On the right, it's the same, except I added two other sources of revenue: the CPA, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with, and then enterprise funds, which it's basically an accounting mechanism where it comes out of the general fund, and it's accounted for separately, all the revenues and all the expenses. So think of water and sewer, airport, parking, golf course, recreational facilities, those types of things are enterprise funds. There's been a move to do more in enterprise funds because it's technically outside of Prop 2.5, and it's full cost recovery. So your water and sewer rates should cover 100% of the costs associated with that service. So two ways to look at it, but bottom line is it's about property taxes. And what I wanted to show is the graph on the right that more than a third of the communities have property taxes that are 75% or more of revenue. So really, really, really dependent upon property taxes. And we'll talk about that. On to the next slide. Okay, so what is Prop 2.5? I always like to joke here and start off with what it isn't. Proposition 2.5 isn't my tax bill can only grow by 2.5%. I think Johnny Q thinks that's the case. A lot of people think that's the case. That's not the case. So it was approved by ballot initiative way back in 1980, went into effect in fiscal 82. And basically there's two caps. The first is that the levy, the amount that you levy in taxes, cannot exceed 2.5% of the assessed value of the total assessed value of the community. The second, and this is by far the more challenging one, is that your annual levy cannot increase by more than 2.5%, except for this thing called new growth, which I'll talk about. The only way you can do that, the only way you can increase it more than 2.5% is you go to the voters to ask for an override or an exclusion from Prop 2.5. Next slide. So just to put some of these terms into a little picture. So the levy ceiling in red is what you cannot exceed. Well, you can with a debt exclusion, but I said I don't want to get in the weeds, so forget I even said it. So 2.5% of assessed value. If you've got $1 billion of assessed value in your community, your levy ceiling is 25 million. You can't go above it. Your levy limit is your each year, what can I levy in taxes? It's got to be below the ceiling, and it's essentially simply prior year levy limit times 2.5% plus new growth plus any overrides. And then the levy is what you actually levy in taxes. It can't be greater than the levy limit. Some places there's a big gap between the levy and the levy limit, and they do that on purpose. In other places like Brookline, it was pretty much, there was a few thousands of dollars of leftover, and it was because of rounding of the tax rate. So levy ceiling 2.5% of value, levy limit last year times 2.5%. Your levy is what you actually choose to levy in taxes. Next slide, I think, is a spreadsheet. Nope, that's the next. Okay, so I mentioned ballot questions. So there's two ways that you can exclude or override the provisions of Prop 2.5. The first one is it's called a general override. It's for operating purposes, and the common theme or the common rationale behind an override, and there's actually one on the ballot in my town in a couple of weeks, is the confines of Prop 2.5 putting pressure on our budget. We need you taxpayers to pay more money in taxes. So, it's democracy at its finest. We go into a booth and we say, yes, I want to pay more in taxes for A, B, and C, or I don't, and I vote no. You can't override your ceiling, that 2.5% of value, but you can increase it above the 2.5%. On the other side is exclusion. Those are temporary. They're for capital, and there's two types. There's take the high school project. You want to borrow for that, intergenerational equity. The cost of the project is spread out. You issue a bond, you pay it, say 30 years, and then once that last principal and interest payment is made, that comes off of the tax levy. Or you can have a capital exclusion. A lot of smaller towns use this. Say, for the example, they want a piece of heavy equipment for DPW. say it's 100 grand. There's a one-time 100% increase in the levy in that year, but the next year it goes away. So overrides, think operating, exclusions, think capital. Next slide. All right, so what is new growth? If you don't know what this is, you need to know what this is. Like, this is a really fundamental and critical part of municipal finance in the Prop 2.5. Think of it as economic activity in the community, okay? So it's an increase in the tax base and becomes a permanent part of the levy limit base. So some examples here. Properties that have increased in assessed value since the prior year because of development or other changes. Or another example, some property that was exempt is now in the tax rolls. New personal property. So think of a new Eversource line underground that is run through the community. That's new personal property. That's new growth. Subdivisions or condo conversions. That's all new growth. New growth has nothing to do with what's going on in the marketplace in terms of what a home's selling for. That impacts your individual tax bill, but it doesn't impact your 2.5 growth. That's not part of new growth. So a basic example, you got a vacant parcel, it's valued at 50 in the prior year. Somebody builds a home on it, valued at 450, probably too low in this environment, but the delta 450 minus 50 is 400. The tax rate was $14.90 per thousand. That's a $6,000 increase in revenue that goes on top of your 2.5% increase. So these can run the gamut from an office tower in Boston to an Amazon warehouse in Andover to a cannabis growing facility in Western Mass to a condo complex in, pick a community. So it's all those types of things. As a budget person, new growth is awesome and it's critical because of the confines of Prop 2.5. Next slide. So here's the spreadsheet. So just to explain how this works. So in year one, my levy limit's 30 million, 2.5% of that 750,000. We had new growth at 450. My levy limit is $31.2 million. That then carries up from here up to here. That's your new base upon which the 2.5% is increased. And then you add your new growth again, you come to 32.4, that carries up here, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see the higher the new growth, the more your base grows. So that's why it's so important. I should have had an example here and compared these with new growth and without new growth, if you could clearly see the difference. I also showed how an override can impact it. So the subtotal was 33.8 million override. Your base is now 34.8. That's what carries up here. Okay. And then I wanted to show debt exclusions. So carry this through 34.8, 870 of 2.5, 500 grand in new growth. My levy limit becomes 36.2. Then we have a debt exclusion. So say this was for the high school, and this is my first debt service payment, principal interest. I got to pay about $2 million. That simply gets added to the levy limit. If you follow the thread, starting point for the next year is the 36.18, not the 38, because this does not come part of the base. Overrides do, debt exclusions or capital exclusions don't. And then just hit enter for 1 sec, because there's one critical thing you always got to remember is that the levy limit cannot exceed the levy ceiling, which is 2.5% of assessed value. So for municipal finance people, they're always looking or should always be looking at this right here. Because if you actually hit your levy ceiling, that's very problematic, very difficult situation. Next slide. State aid, I'll just go through this briefly. Again, I mentioned the state collects all taxes except property. So there's a local aid program. It's about $9 billion. You might hear the term cherry street locally. That's local aid. And it's really two programs. I mean, there were others, but two main ones, a Chapter 70 education aid, and then something called UGA, which stands for Unrestricted General Government Aid. You can see the dollar amounts there. Hit enter for a second to show that state aid is really dependent upon what's going on with the overall economy. Hit enter again. So back in the bad .com days of the early 2000s, you see that it took 5 years to get back to the original 02 level. Even worse, the Great Recession hit and took 7 years to get back to that pre-recession level. So anytime there's a tough economic climate, local aid at best is going to be level funded, and oftentimes it can be cut, which having lived through a few of those, it's miserable, but it happens and it's understandable because the state's making cuts in other parts of their budget. All right, next slide. All right, so where do these stresses come from? You know, you pick up your local paper or you hear a select board meeting or a council meeting and you're talking about cuts, or you're talking about layoffs, or you're talking about overrides. Like, why? So your largest revenue source is capped at Prop 2.5. New growth varies greatly across the state. So there are some places like Watertown, like Somerville, like Boston, with Everett, where there's a lot of new growth. But for most communities who are bedroom communities, there's not a lot of economic development going on. So there's not a lot of new growth. So their largest revenue source grows really by 2.5% plus a little bit of new growth. The majority of communities actually levy to the maximum extent possible. So if my calculation says I can levy $100 million in taxes, I'm levying $100 million in taxes. That's a debate each year when the tax rates get set about how much should we go up to the levy limit. State aid, as I just mentioned, very heavily dependent on the economy, and most of it's for education. Local receipts, I didn't talk about that at all, but basically that's locally generated revenue that isn't property taxes. So think of building permits, interest income, motor vehicle excise, local auction taxes, those types of things. Again, depending upon the economy. Some are better when the economy's bad, some are better when the economy's good. But one thing I want to mention that's really important is 3 of the major ones, motor vehicle excise, meals tax, and lodging tax, have formulas or percentages that are capped by state law. So you can't exceed those, right? We talked about being creatures of the state. Well, state law says this is what the formula is, or this is the max, you can't exceed that. On the expenditure side, obviously it takes people to run local government, police officers, firefighters, teachers, librarians, etc. So you should expect that most of the budget is people, and that is the case in the vast majority of communities. And what drives that, aside from wages, the 2 benefits, the biggest benefit items are pensions and health insurance. A lot of discussion about health insurance now, double-digit premium increases. So you package this stuff together where you have revenues that don't keep pace with inflation, and you've got costs that exceed inflation in some cases, and you have finance people saying, well, we're going to have to make some adjustments to our services, or we need more money via an override. So that's where the stress comes from on the budget side. Next slide. So now I want to transition, and I know we're going to Q&A after, but I want to transition to capital planning for a little bit. So this image here, we at DLS use in a lot of our presentations, kind of call it the 3-legged stool. Financial policies, financial forecast, and the capital improvement plan, all intertwined. They should be done. Not everybody does it, but they should be done as part of the annual budget process that then has a budget document. And let me, next slide, capital plan. I'm gonna start again with what a capital plan is not. A capital plan is not a spreadsheet of wishes, wants, and desires. So I know a number of you said your community has a CIP, but I'd be interested, is it actually a multi-year CIP that is built upon a financial structure based upon financial policies, or is this the hit list of what I want as the police chief, the fire chief, the DPW commissioner, etc. CIP, putting it together used to be one of my responsibilities. I loved it. I miss it. And it's critically important. Sometimes it doesn't get the attention it deserves. Sometimes it takes, a disaster. You think of the major bridge collapses in other parts of the country, or more locally, a water main break, then people stop paying attention to infrastructure. So you all know this. What's the infrastructure in the community? Schools, police stations, fire stations. You got the parks and playgrounds. You got all the critical stuff underground, above ground, street sidewalks that everybody wants maintained. IT, nothing happens with IT. Without IT, I should say. Heavy equipment, whether it's fire trucks or DPW equipment. All that stuff that needs to be maintained and at some point replaced. Managing debt can cripple the community's finances. And then if it's well done, and I think I'm preaching to the choir here, it should be integrated with master plans. Just hit enter. So some examples of these: facilities master plan, an open space master plan, an IT master plan, a climate change I can't say the word, adaptability plan, complete streets plan, a pavement management plan. The pavement condition index. We had that updated every single year in Brookline to make sure that we had enough money going into the road work. So you have these master plans that are then integrated into this larger CIP. Next slide. So what's the process and who are the players? Well, you should have a planning process guided by policies. This should be an annual event where there's an update of the inventory in all capital assets. You should be asking department heads, or department heads should be asked by a management group, what are your requests? There should be prioritization, criteria laid out in your policies, ideally. So it's not just a political process. You should have a financing plan. I should have put that first, but have a financing plan. And this should be done annually. It should be updated every single year. So who are the players? Hit enter. So it's your executive team: mayor, CFO in a city, town manager, town administrator, CFO in a town. Treasurer has to be involved because they're responsible for issuing and management debt. Accountant auditor needs to be involved. Then you have all your department heads: police chief, fire chief, etc. DPW commissioner. They're the ones telling you what's needed. Finance committee, again, going back to that standing body of town meeting, they play a big role in it. Some communities have a formal capital planning committee, and if they do, they play a huge role in making recommendations to town meeting. And then externally, you have your financial advisor and bond counsel who help prepare the votes for town meeting and help you structure debt. Next slide. So an ideal timeline is something like this. In the blue is you don't have a capital improvement committee or CPC, capital planning committee. It's more done by the executive team. So the town manager or CFO or something like that. Same timeline, same people involved in terms of department heads need to say, this is what I need and here's my priorities, and make the case. So ideally this starts over the summer. Forms go out to department heads so that they can submit requests back. Over the fall into the winter, there's a review of those, some priorities are set. Then there's some revenue estimates that are presented publicly in the winter. It's being finalized so that you can go to a spring town meeting with a full capital plan. But what's going to town meeting is the first year items, because you need funding for those, whether it's pay as you go or a bond authorization. So I'm not saying every community does it this way, but this is a best practice approach to pulling together a capital plan. Next slide. Okay, now how do you finance this stuff? Right? Everybody says their project is a priority. So aside from prioritizing, the next question is, well, how do we fund this stuff? So the most common way is to issue debt. So any significant project, you issue debt. It can be 5 years all the way up to 30 years. Actually, in some cases, 40 years. And I mentioned this concept earlier. Intergenerational equity is a common thing that's used when you're determining how long of a bond, how many years should we issue the bond for. And then you build that into your operating budget because you got to pay that back over however many years it is. I mentioned the debt exclusion earlier. For most communities, major projects are done via debt exclusion. Any school project, most school projects, vast majority of school projects, although Watertown did it without, you need a debt exclusion to ask the voters to give you more money to pay for that debt service. Pay as you go or cash capital, it goes by other names. It is exactly what it says. It's cash up front. You're not borrowing money for it. So that can help you with tax levy, free cash. Just think of that as unassigned fund balance that's available for you to spend. Some communities have set up capital stabilization funds that they can tap into. State and federal grants, not so sure about federal grants anymore, but great opportunities at the state. CPA, I already mentioned that as a funding source. And then enterprise funds, the vast majority of them are full cost recovery. So debt service gets built into those rate structures. So water and sewer rates should be sufficient enough to pay back the debt service for those water and sewer projects. Next slide.
And Sean, do you mind if we switch to George in just a moment, so we have time to
Yeah.
get through his piece too? Thanks.
Oh, wait, what did you ask?
We just need to shift to George's side so we don't run out of time, I think. So I didn't
Yeah,
know
go
if we
ahead.
can jump to your last slide to conclude, or if you need to
Go to our website,
wherever it feels right.
mass.gov/DLS.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right.
Okay.
So my goal here was just to put this into perspective from one community and kind of how this works in one real world circumstance. It's good to see that although Sean's example for capital planning is based upon a town government going to town meeting in the spring, we work on basically the same schedule where we try to get capital planning work done early winter in preparation for where we're headed with the budget. We also, because we're a city government and don't have just a spring town meeting, we have a little bit more time to do a budget approval. This year we got it done in May. Budget fiscal years run July 1st to June 30th here in Massachusetts. So you need a budget in place by July 1st. When I worked in Somerville, we would often be taking that vote the last week of June. Here, I really like to have that vote taken in May, and that's what we aim for. But there's this back and forth between the manager and council, the way it works here, where I present a budget overview, they set the budget policy guidelines, we then look at the capital plan, we then present the budget based upon trying to achieve their policy goals. So you can go on to the next the next page here. So, how do we develop budgets? We try to plan 5 years into the future. We try to do capital planning, distinguishing between ongoing costs that may escalate over time and the one-time expenses that are the capital costs. And we focus very carefully on saving reserve funds while ensuring we're able to fund key city programs. I think it's a key here to make sure that we don't leave ourselves with no reserves that hurts our bond rating, but don't stash so much money that we're not meeting our key programs. So if we go on to the next slide, I will just say that one of the key issues surrounding one of the key circumstances surrounding working as a manager in Watertown, and Sean touched on this, is we have had years of aggressive new growth, which has put us in a good financial situation and allowed us to do the high school project without a debt exclusion, which is extremely rare. But really, there's a handful. There's like 5 or 6 communities around Greater Boston that have built off of the growth in the life science labs that have been able to do that, while others have found themselves often moving to overrides and debt exclusions to be able to continue funding even existing operating services. So it makes it hard when you're advocating for an energy program or something to kind of fit into a capital plan that's very tight. This gives you kind of what guides our council and sort of how we make decisions between residents, the council and managers initiatives. Sometimes there are things the Commonwealth requires us to do. And that requires us to keep our focus there. Go on to the next slide. So just an example of a budget document. I'm just going to walk through the budget that we passed last May that is in place from July 1st to June 30th here. If we go to the next step, what you'll see is that, we started with the council giving guidelines. Now, sometimes in a town form, this can be the work between finance committee and a town administrator and the select board. But here I have a city council manager form of government. The council sets policy. I can go to the next slide. They set and they've given us a list, and I think there's like 18 of them, and they've all prioritized them. Now, one thing I'll say for an energy manager that I'm very lucky with here in Watertown is that for the last 3 years in a row, when we've asked them to prioritize their policy guidelines, number one on the list every single time has been that we should enhance the ability to implement the strategies and actions of the climate and energy plan. Makes it easy to put an energy project on the capital plan when you have that sort of guidance coming from your policy board. But there are a variety of different priorities that they give to us. You can go on to the next slide. Then we build a budget based upon that. Everybody likes a good budget pie chart, and I'll just share, ours on the left is is showing our revenue situation where it comes from. As you can see, we are heavily dependent upon property taxes in Watertown, a little bit more so than the average community. And I think if you look on the right, one of the things you'll see is that as we split up our budget, and education always looks like a small piece of the pie in Watertown, but mainly that's because kind of the ways things break down here. We cover the insurance costs and some other things for our teachers on the city side. And reality is, if I included all that, education would be about half the pie. Our debt service slice is a bit bigger than most communities because, like I said, as we grew new growth, we put our high school project in outside of the Prop 2.5 process and funded it with new growth as we were going and borrowing against that new growth. But as you can see, all the city departments, and their little bits and pieces are there of the pie, and every community will be able to give you that perspective on kind of where they do their budget. If you go to the next slide, I just wanted to give an example of one department. I took our community development and planning department with its divisions. We try to write a budget that's descriptive so the community understands what's going on. Here's department mission, description of the divisions. You can go on to the next page. Accomplishments and goals. And we try to tie the department goals to the policy guidelines coming from the council. So if you have a city council or a finance committee or some group that's putting together, this is what our priorities are this year, and you can try to link the priorities to the goals that your department's doing. It makes it easier for a manager to say, this is something we want to do because I'm delivering the elected board and I'm delivering the community the things that they see as most important to them. If you go on to the next slide, this shows our budget lines. Now, the way things generally work in the state, most of the departments will have, you'll see in most places, the departments have a personnel salary line budget and a general expenses budget for operating expenses that are not salary. Over the course of the year, as they spend the money, they can actually, with administrative approval, with my approval, switch money between the lines on the personnel side and switch money between the lines on the expenses side. What they can't do is move money from one department to another, and they can't move money between the personnel line and the capital plan and the operating expense line. So if I decide I suddenly want to fund something with a consultant rather than an employee, then I'm back in front of the city council asking to move money from one place to another. But if I decide that I want to, if I have a person out and a position's vacant and I end up spending more money on overtime for something else, that's a move I can do administratively internally. So that's helpful to me to have some flexibility, but at the same time, I also like to be honest with the council where I say, I'm going to spend $2,700 on office supplies. I don't want to move $200,000 from the transportation line into office supplies and go buy office supplies. And at the end of the year, they're going, what did the manager do? He didn't do anything like he explained it in the budget. These lines are tied to achieving certain goals. One of the things you'll see if you look very carefully, there's the second to last column is additional funding requests where our department, we actually write in on our budget documents what the department had requested of the manager. And in the particular case here, where there's an extra $200,000 additional funding request for transportation services, or $100,000. If you follow across to manager recommends, you'll see I didn't add that money in. We couldn't afford to do that particular item. So we went from 200, we stayed at 200 because I didn't fund that request. Now, I put them in anyway because I want to show what my department heads want that we can't afford in addition to what we can afford. It helps the conversation with the council to see if they wanted to say, hey, let's make that a priority for next year and kind of move things forward. Go to the next slide. This is sort of our overall budget by department, and you can kind of just track departments. One of the things you'll see if you look down at the second to last line at the bottom, if you go to the next slide, I'll just show that line alone. That's the education budget, which, as you can see, is just one line at 59, it was $61,893,912. That all goes over to the school committee, and they build their own budget based on that total. Again, the relationship between the council and the school committee is important to make sure to give them the right number and have the rest of the budget working well. You can go on. And then the capital plan. Now, I really like the way Watertown does capital planning. If you can go to the next slide. So this is a spreadsheet, but this is not a spreadsheet of all our hopes, wishes, and dreams. This is a spreadsheet that has been vetted and has been tested, where departments give us the information they need, and we look at what we can actually fund and how we can fund it. And we express that with the colors in the spreadsheet. You see, we're looking 5 years out. In fiscal year 26, 27, 28, 29, 30. The colors in blue are funded with tax revenue, which means they're going to be pay-as-you-go items that we're going to include in our operating budget. The items in the dark red are the ones that we anticipate borrowing for. There's a purple line there on energy efficiency where we're hoping we can seek energy grants to do, although we will borrow for it if necessary. And then the green ones are the ones that I would really like to fund, but I can't afford right now. You'll see they're mostly in the out years, keeping an eye on that. Is there a future? Do we have to push this out further? Will we get more new growth than we predicted? Is there a operating line that will help us cover that? Will we be able to fund it some different way? So a big one, the one on the bottom, Watertown Square Transportation, we might look at a district improvement financing strategy that takes new tax growth right out of that new development in the district and can borrow against it and fund it. If you look at geothermal updates, which is number 28 on the line, that's a geothermal system that would support three city buildings that are all next to each other in a group over here. Would love to do that project. I can't figure out how to finance it. I'm really hoping that by fiscal year 29 and 30, that there is a higher form of government, state or federal, that has some sort of grant available to do that type of work. So it's in there to acknowledge we really want to do it, but it's in there in that green color because it's not included in our bonding total. So if you just flip to the next slide, sort of shows the totals at the bottom of that capital plan, and you can see I'm trying to keep the tax revenue line, the blue line there, under $4 million every year because that's how much we put into our capital operating costs. I'm trying to keep that grand total from getting too far beyond. It's those numbers are thousands. So basically, the grand total for fiscal year 26 was $55 million. A lot of that comes from different categories. Chapter 90 is state money. Transportation improvement projects are funded. Hopefully, those are funded from state and federal funds as well. So there's a lot of pieces going on here. But if you flip to the slide after, I'm not going to focus on this particular sheet for too long, especially with 3 minutes left to go. But I will just share that what that particular sheet does is it establishes exactly how much borrowing we're doing in every single year over the course of years to come, and make sure that we can plug a debt service number into our budget and our financial projections in such a way that says, okay, this debt service is something that we can afford based upon where our revenue projections are. And our revenue projections are going down because we're not getting as much new growth because no one's building the big lab buildings right now. And our council wants to do a whole lot of big projects. So I'm trying to make this all still work. This was the toughest capital plan to put together, but the exercise is important. It's what gets us where we need to go. So last slide, I kind of left a few parting thoughts. To understand local government, the community charter, the form of government, who appoints key positions, how the budget's developed, how the capital plan's developed, how the annual schedule for all of those things go, and how municipal and school officials work together are all important. And I will just say a lot of communities do good capital planning. A lot of communities do that thing where they got the spreadsheet wish list and it's really tough where they kind of pick off year after year what they're doing. But I hope if you're working in a place that is really thinking out capital planning, that you have a chance to be able to take energy projects, put them into the capital plan, and establish how the debt service off of any borrowing is offset by the operational savings of the energy efficiency program you're doing. And hopefully that is a recipe for success. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so